this book, A Whole New Mind, has a metaphor at its heart, and it's a metaphor of our brains, all right? Our brains, as all of you know, are divided in half. You've got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Now, most of you know that there's been a lot written about left brain and right brain over the years. And what we know about our brains is this. They're really complicated, okay? They're really complicated. We use both sides of our brain for everything that we do. But at this broad topographical level, our brains are also really kind of efficient and elegant in their own way. Over time, they've done this spectacular job of dividing up tasks. They have different specialties. This side specializes in one set of tasks, tasks that are logical, linear, sequential, analytical. Okay, this side specializes in a different set of tasks. Not better or worse or harder or easier, it's just a different department. So it specializes in processing things all at once rather than in sequence. So it will identify, if you were to read Corporate Innovation and Design Experience 2010 timeline, you would go across in a linear way and read that. And think about a 5-year-old or 6-year-old learning how to read, sounding out a word, moving sequentially left to right if they're in English. That's how the left brain processes things. The right hemisphere processes it all at once. So it doesn't identify this as a gladiator workbench. It doesn't read it across like it would a sentence. It processes it all at once, okay? Simultaneous. It deals with synthesis rather than analysis and does context rather than text, okay? Logical, linear, analytical on one side, simultaneous, context and synthesis on the other side. That's really, honestly, that's about 40 years of neuroscience in 35 seconds. But more important than that is that that yields, I think, a very powerful metaphor for understanding, I think, labor markets, for understanding organizations, I think to some extent for understanding the contours of our times. And the way the metaphor works is this. It used to be that the most important abilities in any kind of white-collar function were characteristic of the left hemisphere. Logical, linear, sequential, analytical, step-by-step, spreadsheet, SAT, dare I say, MBA abilities. And today, and this is important to underscore here, those abilities are absolutely necessary. I want to underscore that. Those abilities are absolutely necessary. You must have them. If you don't have those abilities, you're in a world of hurt. But in contrast to, say, when I was growing up, those abilities today are necessary, but they're no longer sufficient. And it's now abilities characteristic of this hemisphere. Artistry, empathy, inventiveness, design thinking, big picture thinking. Those are now the abilities that matter most. So if you look at certain kinds of left brain abilities, there are 3 forces that are tilting the scales in favor of the right. Asia, that is, it's possible to offshore all kinds of routine, rule-based white-collar work. White-collar work that in this country used to get you into the middle class. Certain kinds of accounting is routine. That is, you can algorithmic, you can write down a list of steps and it has a right answer. Any kind of work like that can just race wherever in the world it can get done the cheapest. Last century, machines replaced our back, our muscle. This century, software is replacing our brain. But what part of the brain can software replace? It's difficult for software to do the artistic, empathic, big picture side. It's easier for software to do the more routine, left brain, rule-based side. So, and this is where in this country we have a very misplaced conversation. We go crazy over offshoring. If a job gets offshored to India or someplace else. Huge political issue. Talk radio lights up. Politicians rail against it. But it's not the bigger issue. The bigger issue is automation. So Asia, automation, and then there's the final A, abundance, which is that despite the dicey economy, despite all the dangerous bad things that are happening, we live in a world of incredible material abundance. Or not a world, but we live in a country, at least, of material abundance in this country is staggering by historic standards. Staggering by international standards. Think about my childhood. My family didn't have a color television set till I was, I think, 15 or 16. When I was born in the early 1960s, you had about 2% of American homes had a color TV set. Now you have something like 99.8% of American households have a color TV set. This is in a country with a 13% poverty rate. Okay? 13% of our households live in poverty. 99+% of our households have a color television set. In a world where people's material needs have been satisfied and oversatisfied, there's a premium on iterating something new, on giving people something they didn't know that they were missing. To me, that's an artistic act. Artists give people things folks didn't know that they were missing. But that's the best business strategy. You know, think about a world of 99% color television penetration. And you're selling televisions. You probably have a meeting going on right now where some genius is saying, oh, we have a 45-inch screen TV, let's do a 47-inch screen TV. That's a game changer. You know? But that's not a game changer. You need something radically different. And so if you add this all up, Asia automation and abundance, that tilts the scales in favor of these right brain abilities. You have to be able to do work that's hard to outsource, hard to automate, and that iterates something new. Hard to send overseas, hard to reduce the lines of code in a computer program, and that gives the world something it didn't know was missing. And what that means is that you've got to have the analytic chops. You've got to have the those left brain abilities, but they're simply not enough. And it's really these right brain abilities that are the ones that matter most. That leads to what are the abilities that matter most? And I argue that there's 6 that matter the most. There's things like design. I think design has become a fundamental business literacy. There are many businesses that wouldn't hire somebody who didn't have a passing familiarity with, say, a spreadsheet and what it does and how it works. I think the same thing is happening with design. You have to be literate in design. I think it's become a fundamental literacy in the world of business. Things like, so there's design, there's story. That is story. We live in a world of ubiquitous facts, so facts are everywhere and they're free. So something that is free, ipso facto, I learned that in law school, ipso facto has no value, right? What matters more is being able to put facts in context and deliver them with emotional impact. That's what a story does. So you see story migrating in some very, very interesting ways to product and service differentiation. In fact, I think in that regard, story is where design was 15 years ago as a differentiator in a crowded marketplace. There's the ability that I call symphony, which is big picture thinking, pattern recognition, seeing the big picture, connecting the dots. It's the killer app, I'm convinced. And so having this hyper-muscled ability here to see around corners, to see the patterns, to not get... Richard Branson has said that he didn't understand financial statements until a couple of years ago. Right, this is a guy who's a billionaire, who's built businesses in all these kinds of industries, because it's just not how his brain worked. But he could see around corners, he could connect the dots. Empathy. Empathy is the ability to stand in someone's shoes, feel with their heart, see with their eyes. Okay, it's a fundamentally human ability, but it's hard to outsource and it's hard to automate. And so that makes it more valuable. So the Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia has developed something, a metric called the JSPE, the Jefferson Scale of Physician Empathy. Because there are ways, like any kind of psychological attribute, to measure it in a somewhat valid way. They do the measures of physician empathy, and they notice that the scores on this empathy index correlate very well with patient outcomes. Now, what doesn't correlate with patient outcomes? GPA, MCAT scores, medical board scores. There's not a negative correlation. There's not a negative correlation at all. It's random, okay? And you can interpret from that if you make it to medical school, you probably have the analytic chops to be an okay doctor. But if you want to be more than okay, it's other things that really matter. And so as a result of having that metric, of measuring something that we, like empathy, which we think of as kind of so inscrutable, that JSPE, there's clinical empathy being taught in just about every medical school in North America now. So that's empathy. Play is laughter, humor, and games as a form of learning, as a form of social cohesion. And finally, there is meaning. All of this stuff that we have, our refrigerators full of Go-Gurt, and our super powerful iPhones, and our 87-inch color television sets, haven't actually made us all that happier. You have in this country generally rising, over time, rising levels of prosperity, but stagnating levels of subjective well-being, of satisfaction. And I think that as a result of that gap between rising prosperity and stagnating satisfaction, you have a wider spread search for meaning and purpose and significance that I think is being acted out in many businesses. We're seeing this now in part, I think, with the inadequacy of the profit motive as a motivator. Profit motive is a good thing. I think it's a good thing morally. It's a more sophisticated argument, but it's an argument that we can make. I think it's a good thing morally. It's certainly a good thing for efficiency. Okay? But the profit motive isn't the only thing. I think that what we're seeing now is that the profit motive, while it's an important thing, it's not the only thing. And I think that if you're talking about talented people who are doing this kind of right brain work more and more, who are doing the more creative conceptual work, that the rallying cry that you sometimes hear inside of firms, let's raise earnings per share 3 cents this quarter. I just don't think that's the kind of thing that makes a really talented, creative person leap out of bed in the morning and race to work to do something amazing. I just think it's not sufficiently motivating. And so I think what you're seeing more and more is the rise of what you might call the purpose motive. That is this idea that business, any kind of institution, can be about something larger than itself, and that when individuals contribute to that, together they can do something that leaves an imprint on the world that isn't purely about profit maximization, but that has a sense of purpose behind it. And so, point being that if you look at the abilities that are necessary in the world of work, you see this shift away from the left brain to the right brain for very, very hard-headed reasons. Left brain work is easy to outsource, it's easy to automate it, and right brain work allows you to iterate something new. And then you see this suite of abilities that are often kind of shoved to the periphery. Things like design, things like story, things like symphony, empathy, play, and meaning. Those are abilities that we don't typically think of as being quote-unquote smart. There are things that were considered soft, or things that were considered foo-foo, or things that were considered not, they're fine, but kind of ornamental. And now I think they're becoming much more central. Those MFA capabilities are very, very hard to replicate, very, very hard to turn into algorithms. And they're so enormously important in business. But I think that the real thing is this combination of MFA-style thinking and MBA-style thinking. And that's really where I think the action is.